Good evening, everybody. My name is Jamie Fisher, and I'm the faculty director of the UC Davis Humanities Institute. I'm faculty in German and in cinema digital media at University of California, Davis, and I want to welcome you all to our annual UC Davis Humanities Institute Human Rights Watch Film Festival, which is co-sponsored by UC Davis Human Rights Studies as well as Human Rights Watch Film Festival. We consult with them on the choice of films we have each year for this film festival. Before we get started, I'd like to give a special thanks to our DHI staff, especially to Gina Nunez, to Elliot Pollard, and to Kathy Wallerstein, without whom really this whole festival couldn't have happened, especially this year where we had additional challenges due to having an online festival, unfortunately. So we look forward to next year when we can all be back in person. I'd also like to thank the festival co-sponsors this year, including the Minetti Shrem Museum here on campus, the Crocker Art Museum in Sacramento, the B.T. Darya Bari Endowment in the Persian language and literature, the Hemispheric Institute on the Americas, and BAMFA, the Berkeley Art Museum and Pacific Film Archive. The UC Davis Humanities Institute is a leading voice on our campus for the essential value of the arts and humanities, and part of our mission is to underscore how the humanities and arts can, and we think should, contribute to debates and controversies in the broader society. And so we're delighted to partner with the UC Davis Human Rights Program toward this end, toward making kind of a humanistic and artistic imagination and perspective really crucial to important political, social issues facing our entire globe these days. The film for tonight that you can watch via our player available on the UC Davis Humanities Institute website, that's dhi.ucdavis.edu, is called Born in Evin. It was made by Maryam Zaree, who unfortunately couldn't be here tonight, but we have two great faculty members from Davis who will be discussing the film tonight. We talked about how best to present it to you all and thought that it would be worthwhile to show a short clip of the film at the beginning, and then to commence our conversation between our two faculty members, Professor Motlagh and Professor Watenpaugh. So Professor Amy Motlagh is Associate Professor of Comparative Literature in Middle East South Asian Studies and the inaugural B.T. Darya Bari Presidential Chair in Persian Languages and Literature at UC Davis. She's also the Associate Director of the Middle East South Asia Studies Program at UC Davis. Motlagh's first book was Burying the Beloved, Gender, Fiction, and Reform in Modern Iran from Stanford University Press in 2012. And her other publications focus on topics including Iranian cinema, genre and narrative, ideologies of gender and race, and life writing in the Iranian diaspora. She's currently at work on two projects dealing respectively with Iranian cinema and human rights discourse and with the influence of American ideologies of race on modern Persian literature. And she'll be in conversation with Professor Keith Watenpaugh. Keith David Watenpaugh is Professor of Human Rights Studies at the University of California, Davis, a leading American historian of the contemporary Middle East, human rights, and modern humanitarianism. He is an expert on genocide and its denial, and the role of the refugee and displaced peoples in world history. Professor Watenpaugh is the founding director of the UC Davis Human Rights Studies program, the first academic unit of its kind in the entire University of California system. He's been a leader of international efforts to address the needs of displaced and refugee university students and professionals, primarily those affected by the wars and civil conflicts in Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, Turkey, and now Armenia. Over 2020 to 2021, he is a UC Davis Public Scholarship and Engagement Fellow and holds fellowships in public scholarship from both the UC Davis Humanities Institute and the UC-wide UCHRI, or University of California Humanities Research Institute. Since 2013, Professor Watenpaugh has directed an international multidisciplinary research project to assist refugee university students and scholars fleeing the war in Syria. This project has garnered support from the Carnegie Corporation of New York, the Open Society Foundations, and the Ford Foundation. He recently won the IIE Centennial Medal for his efforts. He is author most recently of the multi-award-winning Bread from Stones, The Middle East and the Making of Modern Humanitarianism from University of California Press 2015, and has studied, lived, and worked in Aleppo, Damascus, Istanbul, Beirut, Yerevan, Baghdad, and Cairo. Professor Watenpaugh teaches graduate and undergraduate courses in human rights, genocide, and humanitarianism, and he's finishing a new book, Most Human, Storytelling, Human Rights, and Star Trek. And we're delighted to partner with Professor Watenpaugh regularly for the purposes of this film festival. So Thank you both. I think I will now leave you, but I'll be in the background and I'll play this clip. Let us know in the chat room if there's any problem with the clip quickly. It's about a 3-minute clip from near the beginning of the film that really frames the film quite well, I think, and foregrounds some of the issues that the film takes up, which are really about the Iranian diaspora.
Last time I did see him, it was in one of the most horrible places in the world. But of course, I didn't know about that. Today, I'm 35 years old, and I know my father couldn't be with us because he was trapped in a political prison called Evin. I also know I was born in that prison, and that's basically everything I know. I mean, I know I'm an actress and I'm pretty good at telling other people's stories, but I'm at a point in my life where I don't want to hide behind those stories anymore. I want to find out what my story is. But where in the world to start?
Ich halte es mir hinten fest. Genau, so, siehst du, das ist jetzt schon das, was sozusagen als erstes ein bisschen Halt gibt. Da müssen wir jetzt gucken. Das würde ich dann letztendlich gerne an die Maske abgeben, dass sie das mit dir machen, dass die Haare verschwinden. So. Hast du es beim Gesicht? Okay. Jetzt nehme ich hier die Dinger und dann binde ich dir das wieder hinten. So, mal schauen.
Ich meine, ich will auch gar nicht, weißt du, so jetzt wirklich nicht ein Drama machen, aber ich habe das ihm auch schon gesagt, dass ich das ich kann es auf keinen Fall anziehen, weil es überhaupt keinen Sinn macht und wahnsinnig auch ein komisches Bild auf die Flüchtlinge wirft, weil kein Mensch so ankommt auf irgendeinem Boot oder die Balkanroute oder so. Es ist so unrealistisch. Und es ist wirklich schlecht recherchiertes, beschissenes deutsches Fernsehen, was einfach keine Ahnung hat und dumme Rassisten sind. So sieht es dann aus. Damit unsere Eltern fliehen aus dem Iran, damit ihre Kinder solchen Dreck spielen müssen. Okay?
Wenn du das so gleich noch kurz anlassen kannst, lass ich dann ein Foto machen.
Okay. For a long time, I had been upset with my work as an actress. I was tired playing those cliches of refugees who fled from made-up horrors. I had been a refugee myself, and I had a story to tell. I mean, born in prison. Who in the world is born in prison and why? The problem was, I had no clue what my story was, and finding it out actually terrified me. What I knew.
Okay, we all set?
Yeah, so I'll just perhaps begin by saying how much I like the way this film begins by disrupting a lot of our expectations about Iranian women in the diaspora. First of all, I love the metaphor of the parachute, right? And seeing her drop down and dragging this thing behind her, I think is a wonderful metaphor that kind of ties together her experience vis-a-vis her parents' incarceration and her birth in prison, and that she's carrying the weight of this memory without actually having the memory. I also like the way that we begin by seeing her preparing to be in hijab, right? And for me, as somebody who's a reader of a lot of autobiographies and memoirs by Iranian women in diaspora, my first expectation was that she was preparing for a trip of return, since a lot of these memoirs have been called return narratives, and that she's just trying to get everything right since she's never been to Iran as an adult. And then suddenly we find her, completely rejecting the stereotype of this kind of preparation for hijab. And how it's going to be packaged and presented in a media form for German television or film. So I really appreciated the way that it immediately kind of recognizes a number of different stereotypes about Iranians in diaspora, particularly Iranian women, and then rejects them. And we kind of start the film afresh with her saying that she's going to go and find more about her family's past. Keith?
Thank you. And this is my chance to also thank Professor Fisher and the DHI for the opportunity for the UC Davis Interdepartmental Program in Human Rights Studies to collaborate on this initiative. We've been doing this for many years now, and it's one of my favorite events in the fall. And before we went on camera, Professor Mutlaq and I were reminiscing about how when we were younger we would go to movies and then afterwards have a conversation afterwards. And that's one of the things I really miss about not being able to attend films like this in person. But in many ways, our general film watching habits have changed, and that's not, we don't go to big theaters anymore. We just prop these films up open on our lap and watch them on the screen. So this is a wonderful opportunity to return to some of that wonderful practice that filmmakers want us to engage in. They want us to watch their films and then talk about them afterwards. And so this is certainly a film I've been wanting to talk to someone about for a while, because I found it at times extremely moving, just a deeply moving film, and not necessarily because of the larger historical narrative of the imprisonment of Iranian political prisoners, which is something we know about. We teach in our modern Middle East courses, our human rights to the Middle East courses, and in your courses and so on. But to my mind, this is one of the first films from Iranian and diaspora and Iranian cinema that really tries to follow the impact of political imprisonment on the children of political prisoners in any sophisticated way. And in fact, Maryam herself was a political prisoner, at least for a few years of her life too, as a young girl. And you said something when we were off camera, that you thought, oh, when I first came to this film, I thought this was just going to be one more sort of auteur film about being Iranian and so on. And you noticed it was a little bit different. And I was wondering if you could expand on that point for us. What you saw as different about this film from others in its sort of, I guess, is there what we call the genre sort of Iranian diaspora cinema or refugee cinema, or what would we want to call it?
Well, I really see it as being a kind of cinematic memoir. And I think partly I'm influenced by the fact that a lot of my work has been on memoir and autobiography produced by the diaspora. That's been there was an explosion of writing over the last 20 years, beginning around 2003, 2004. A lot of diasporic cinematography has not been about telling a personal story. It's been about telling other people's lost stories. And what I liked about this film is that it does both. And it situates this very personal story within a broader historical event, right? The incarceration of political prisoners after the revolution. And it also tries to, I like the way in which I think a film like this is always in danger of becoming self-indulgent in the same way that memoir is. And I thought the film really carefully backed away from that and told the story in a way that allowed us to see this person's unique experience at the same time that we could see it as part of a collective experience.
Right, and unlike most memoir, it's the author or the auteur doing most of the talking, this was not a film where she did all the talking. There was a lot of her listening. And I think that's the underlying story, right? She wants someone to tell her what happened. And alongside that, tell us what happened. I mean, it was good storytelling too, because there was a bit of what's going to be the big reveal? There really wasn't one, right? And that I found that wonderful. I just thought that was great. So I for me, it brought up a couple very important, larger human rights issues that I've been thinking about a lot lately, and I always think about because of the way states will often work very hard to deny past atrocities. And that's the right to truth on both the individual level and the societal level. That, you know, that truth is at the beginning of the kinds of processes that lead to reconciliation in some cases, or injustice in the others, and hopefully both at the same time. And so I thought that was something that I appreciated about this, is that she and the others that she was talking to recognized that there was a truth to the story, but also that sometimes that truth might be too hard to speak or too hard to hear. And it reminds me of work that, for example, my colleague Michael Azara has done on the children that disappeared in authoritarian Argentina, where children of leftists, opponents of the regime, or not even opponents of the regime, when women who were pregnant were taken into prison, and then those children were taken from them and then raised by the very state and the very generals who were imprisoning and oppressing them. But it also reminds me of something that is very, very pronounced in the study of genocide, which is that often it takes a generation or two before people are willing to talk about what was experienced. And often they don't want to tell their own children. And rather, a grandparent might tell a grandchild, skipping a generation. And in fact, that was noted at one point in the film. And and it's this notion of not wanting to burden your children with the past. And then on the other side, of course, Maryam was saying, I want to know. And of course, by not telling her, she was filling in all these blanks on her own. So this is why I'm hoping that we can see more films like this from other kinds of experiences of the children of people who have faced this kind of trauma of either displacement or torture or political victimization, because it really, I think it speaks to how, when states visit human rights abuses upon individuals, ultimately it's not just on them, it's on the people who love them and their children and their children's children who face these problems. So I was hoping if you had a response to that or a thought to pin off of that, and then we'll start moving into questions. I think that would be great.
I think what I would add to that, Keith, is just my own experience as a member of this particular diaspora, is that it's not simply the silence or will to silence at the state level that's troubling, but it's also, in my experience and observation, people don't want to hear these stories, and they're disturbing to them, and to some extent they do not want to believe the stories. I've seen some very troubling instances of denials related to somebody's anecdotal experience of prison, right? And I think this is just a dark part of the history, and I like that the way the film spoke to that, and tried to, shine some light, as it were, into some of these dark corners, because there just isn't. It's an interesting kind of conflict or paradox. I think there is so much thirst, in one way, for stories about oppression of women in Iran, in particular. But somehow when we move into the realm of political prisoners, and the violence that they may have experienced in prison, and that is passed on to their children in ways like this, I don't find that there's the same kind of thirst for that kind of narrative in the way that there has been for something like reading Lolita in Tehran, and other kinds of first-person accounts of life after the revolution. So I appreciated that aspect of this film, and I hope that it'll lead to more conversations in people who go see the film and then can have conversations about it afterwards, because I'm sure almost everybody knows somebody who has a connection to imprisonment in Iran. I don't think that's an overstatement.
Right, I think that's absolutely. I mean, I grew up living around refugees from the era of the Shah. I'm that old. I had friends that I worked with who were Kurdish refugees, and then, of course, in Los Angeles, we had the next great wave. But you're right, everyone either had spent time in prison or knew someone in prison or knew someone who died in the 88 massacres. And it's in many ways I mean, looking at this very much from the outside, but also someone who has seen the same thing happen in Syria and Turkey, where shared imprisonment by various governments is often one of the shared experiences that people have, especially if you're an intellectual or a poet or a writer or something along those lines, is that, I think these stories should be told. And, what I appreciate about Maryam is, she didn't tell us that her parents were communists, right? She didn't talk about the specificities of their political activism, because nothing could justify, in fact, their imprisonment, right? That they were imprisoned as just a gross human rights violation. It had nothing to do with their politics. They were just not in line with the regime. And I liked that, right? I thought that was great. And there's just one other thought I wanted to share with you and get your sense of, and this again comes from sort of this idea that the children, what burden children of political prisoners or children of genocide survivors will often share, which is this idea that they can't fail. In other words, they're not allowed to fail because they'll be letting down the memory of the trauma and the pain that their parents went through. People, there's jokes about this, that you could imagine, but also, I'm married to someone who is in that status, and I can see it in the commitment to trying to succeed, and how, I can't imagine this is a burden that their own parents want them to bear, but I think they take it on themselves. Thoughts?
Yeah, I thought that was a very powerful moment in the film where she's talking to the woman who spoke at the tribunal about her mother's execution, and they're talking. I mean, one of the things that I think is really interesting in this film is all of the languages, right, of diaspora. And I thought it was very affecting that Maryam actually she could speak Persian, right, somewhat pretty fluently, and she's comfortable speaking it with her parents, but she's uncomfortable speaking it in front of an audience of native Persian speakers. And I thought it was interesting to see the way that she connected to all of these different people who had a shared experience in different languages. And so she, and I think the woman's name was it Shora or Shore?
Sure.
When they were talking afterwards about this burden of success that they have to carry that you've just been describing, I thought that was very moving. And also these kind of dual burdens of the guilt, right? And the guilt is in some ways what inspires the will to succeed, right? And she mentioned the guilt, not just of having subjected their children to this, but also the guilt and shame of having lost the revolution. Which, right. I mean, can you think of a more enormous burden to give to your kids to carry? But I agree. I thought that was a very moving conversation, especially where she foregrounded that issue.
In fact,
I think we're accumulating a lot of questions, Keith. I don't know how you want to address
I just wanted to get your sense of Shura and Maryam. At one point, Shura says we were on different sides, or we were. Could you clarify that point for me? I'm just wondering what that was.
On a different side of the revolution? That was how I took it to mean. I took it to mean that their parents had lost the revolution, right? They were part of the political faction that was defeated and suppressed.
I thought perhaps one was a royalist family, one was a Marxist family, or something like that. That's how.
I don't know. I didn't have that.
All right, Jamie, can you help us with questions? Is that? work.
I
I've got a
see.
couple here.
Do you want me to, should I
I
read
see
them?
3 in the
Yeah,
Sure, just
we
go
put
ahead.
them in that document. So, okay, first question. We had many good questions, and Gina Nunez and I were editing them. So they go mostly in chronological order that they were asked. From Noman Gankuyag, can you please provide some historical background on what actually happened in Iran that resulted in political imprisonments? It was hard to grasp what actually happened from the film.
Sure. So the Iranian Revolution, what's called the Iranian Revolution of 1979, actually began a year earlier in 1978 and had been brewing, aspects of it had been brewing for some time. And this was actually a broad-based, multi-factional movement to overthrow the monarch, the Shah of Iran. It didn't begin necessarily with that goal, but as time went on, it became clear that that was the only satisfying response to the revolutionary movement. So there were, people who were communists involved, Iranian communists. There were people who were other kinds of political dissidents. The story that we hear most about is the Islamist movement that was involved and that came to the fore, right? That was ready to take power after the revolution. So that's kind of in a nutshell what happened. And the aftermath that this film deals with is that the new government, which called itself the Islamic Republic of Iran, moved pretty quickly to suppress dissidents, all kinds of dissidents. So a lot of people who had actually been revolutionaries, student revolutionaries, there was a huge student population, Iranian student population abroad. They had come back to participate in the revolution, and they found themselves being persecuted after the revolution. So some of them fled, some of them stayed and tried to fight for what they believed in, and some of them were imprisoned. And that's the story that Maryam tells in this film.
And there were years of particular persecution, of executions and torture. I think Professor Wadenpaugh referred to 1988. Was that right?
Right, 1988 is mentioned several times in the film. It was a kind of another crackdown where there were a huge number of executions.
And it was during the Iran-Iraq War.
Right, towards the end.
It was towards the end of the Iran-Iraq War, and it was a settling of scores and radicalization of the leadership in Iran. So it was, periodically authoritarian states do this. It just always strikes me as one of the most horrible things they do, is that they, in this case, they'll just open the prison doors to another faction or an intelligence service. We'll just go in and pull people out and murder them. That will then allow the state to say, oh, we're sorry, we don't know what happened. They weren't able to stand trial. It creates a way to eliminate political opposition without having to sort of go through at least the motions of some kind of trial and process. So that's what happened in 88. It was a terrible, 88 for Iran, Iraq was just a horrible year. It just was.
I guess this is a related question from an anonymous attendee. Why would Maryam not have been back to Iran? Would she risk being arrested there?
I think I can imagine there are a number of reasons why she wouldn't want to go back, and the film doesn't fully elaborate on what her parents' politics are. As Keith and I could make a pretty good guess about what they were. It's also clear that her father is released much later and faced an execution order. So I can understand why the child of people who had been imprisoned in that way might not wish to return. There are a lot of people who feel some trepidation about returning, even if they have no stated, political dissidents, no stated political opposition to the state. People still may feel some trepidation. If you follow the news, even the New York Times, there have been a number of imprisonments of dual citizens, people who hold Iranian and foreign citizenship, and also of people who are scholars, PhD candidates who have been incarcerated. I think there are still a few there's one from Australia who's been in the news lately. So
So it is a real danger, actually.
Yes.
Oh, yeah. There's a randomness to it. And that's what induces the fear. But that's also how an authoritarian regime works.
Right.
Is it always keeps you a little bit off balance. And to some extent, Miriam and all these children in prison were like hostages to the families outside, right? So, I mean, on one level, many countries leave children in prison with their mothers until they're 2 or 3 years old, even in parts of the United States. And, there's no international human rights law that says children, as long as they're taken care of, can be in prison when they're young, but should be allowed to leave later. But Iran, I think that there's something, I wish they'd explored this part a little bit more, which is that Iran really, I think, cultivated this sort of imprisonment of very little children, of political prisoners, as a way to demand compliance from the grandparents, from all the other relatives outside of prison who, it just adds one more life to hold hostage in terms of political control.
And there's actually been a recent case involving a situation like that. An Iranian woman who was married to a British man. They have a child who's a dual citizen. The mother was imprisoned for several years. And there was, at first, the Iranian government seized the child's British passport and wouldn't let her leave. And then there was a negotiation about whether she should stay in Iran so that the mother could see her while in prison. So it's an ongoing issue.
Good. We had a question from Paloma Ramos asking, I think, about something that Professor Wattenpaugh mentioned. Would the Iranian government kidnap children and give them to political elites the same way that Argentina did? Because that is actually left a little vague in the film, as I guess she was in a kind of childcare within the prison.
I'm trying to remember what I remember from Sahar's, I looked at Sahar's book, but I can't. This is something that Dr. Motlach should really answer, not me.
I'm not aware of any sustained practice. I'm not even aware of a single case like that. I think in the case of this child, and it sounded like most of the children who were in the film, if they were in the prison, they were with their mothers and witnessed, in some cases, pretty horrible things. Eventually, Maryam was released from prison and handed to her one of her grandparents or sets of grandparents who raised her until the mother was released. I don't think there's any kind of systematic practice like there was in Argentina.
No, it's
Because,
yeah.
okay.
No, I mean, child transfer is often happens with genocide and with what was going the dirty wars in South America, but I haven't heard any of this in the Middle East at all. I mean, this with the exception of the period after the genocide of the Armenians in 1915.
Okay, we have another question from Mackenzie Nye. Would you say that the tribunal depicted in the film, I guess the one in The Hague, although it did not lead to any legal repercussions for the Iranian Republic, was valuable because of the space it allowed for truth-telling? How can more spaces like that be created?
So there have been several tribunals like that. People's tribunals have a very rich history. There have been ones on, for example, the American invasion and occupation of Iraq, on the political prisoners in Iran. There's been the People's Tribunal on the war in Syria. And there's been People's Tribunals on indigenous rights and in North America and in Australia. So it's an extra governmental form of tribunal that seeks to use the methods of accumulating evidence and documentation and providing an opportunity for a public hearing. And these public tribunals, they get things on the record that states aren't willing to do. I mean, Iran, it'd be very difficult, I think, for Iran to face any kind of successful criminal sanction for its activities towards its own people in The Hague without, some great change in the way that the ICC works. So these tribunals are important. I think that these tribunals also function to tell people who've been oppressed, who faced political imprisonment, that what they experienced really happened. It's not, they didn't just make it up, that it's recognized, it's affirmed, and that other people shared that experience with them. And I think there's probably nothing worse than if you've been a political prisoner to have doubt shed on that experience. And so these public tribunals are, short of trying to get justice through an international criminal court, which, will take a generation. These can be a very effective tool.
I guess this is a question for Professor Motlog, and this is about some of the memory mechanisms that are depicted in the film, which I think we can agree are really a strength of the film. Is it common, would you say, for parents not to have detailed very much to their children of these difficult years? How are these memories kind of quote unquote normally passed on? And how does that affect the relationship between parents and their children?
Are we talking just about political imprisonment, or in general about the trauma of the revolution? I mean, I'll start out by talking about the prison.
I mean, it's a big topic, obviously. Yeah.
Right. I think it really depends on the family and the circumstances of the imprisonment. Of course, people were not just imprisoned for their political beliefs. There were many people imprisoned for their religious beliefs. I have heard stories from people, not from my own family, but I think it really just depends on the individuals, the circumstances of the imprisonment, the duration, whether or not it's going to be something that the family talks about among themselves with their children and or publicly. I think it also depends a lot on where you land in the diaspora. I thought it was actually really nice and interesting to hear a story from Europe. Of course, it eventually ended up in what they call Yengedonia, the other side of the world, in America and California, of course. But I really like that kind of decentering, because so much of the kind of narrative about diaspora and trauma has come from people who've settled in the US. And it was nice to hear the perspective from another place that's actually geographically much closer to Iran and feels like it's more part of the same sphere. But that's all to say that I think it's very individually dependent. It would be interesting to see some research on whether or not, how often this gets passed down. It would be a great subject for a paper.
One of the interesting things that was depicted in the film were a series of organizations, kind of civil society organizations in different places, actually. And we have a question that's related to that. What kind of NGOs are there in place that help survivors and former political prisoners to assimilate into society in countries they move to help them deal with these traumas? And some of them are depicted in the film. Wondering if you know of NGOs that are active in this kind of space, and then also maybe the role they played in the film, which I thought was pretty interesting as well.
Keith, do you want to answer that? I actually don't know of many NGOs for Iranians. I know of ones for. Go ahead.
This is a critical field in the intersection of human rights studies and medicine and psychology. One of the leading places where this has been studied is at the University of California, San Francisco's Center for the Study of Torture, where efforts have been made to understand the immediate and the immediate physical needs of survivors of torture or other kinds of brutal imprisonment, and then connecting them with the resources to help them in the longer term. I think that most contemporary resettlement NGOs, and even in Europe, resettlement of refugees is often falls to state agencies. By the United States, it falls to non-governmental organizations, the International Rescue Committee being one of the most prominent ones. The psychosocial dimensions of resettlement have been very well integrated into that process. This is still a road that people often have to travel on their own, but I think there's a much better consciousness of the impacts of these kinds of trauma. And in part, this is because of, in many ways, the shared experience of soldiers coming home from the wars over the last generation, having similar kinds of trauma. So there's just a growing understanding of that process. So there are many out there. I'm very, very, I've always thought that the center at San Francisco was just a remarkable place. And all my dealings with resettlement organizations, they're not just thinking about people's bodies, but people's minds as that process goes through.
Okay, we have another question from Sasha Lyons. The reluctance of the Iranian survivors to speak on their memories seem to be quite different from other populations of survivors, like the Jewish community or people from South Africa. Is this perhaps because the powers that oppressed Iranians are still in power and that they are afraid, or could it also be cultural or due to their experience as political prisoners? This is actually something that's in, oh, go ahead, Amy.
So, no, go ahead and finish, Jamie.
Yeah, I was just going to make the point that this is something actually invited in some ways by the film because of the way that the film investigates the marriage of her mother to a Holocaust trauma survivor and expert.
Yeah, I thought that was a nice, it was a lucky way of being able to frame it. I guess what I would say about that is I think that there was not immediately an audience for testimonies about the Holocaust from Holocaust survivors. It took time for those audiences to be created and to become sensitive to that. In the Iranian context, I would say there actually are quite a few prison memoirs. I think offhand of at least 7 that have been published in the US in the last 10 to 15 years. But I think overall in the field, what's discussed is a kind of reticence of speaking of the self, that is something that's frowned upon in, let's say, Persianate cultures. And there's an idea that you only share yourself like with intimates, right? So the American culture of confessionalism is somewhat foreign to Iranians, and I think it's preserved in the diaspora, right? There's an expression that your parents will tell you, right, which is preserve. I mean, I suppose the translation is preserve appearances at all costs, right? So the idea is that there are things that should not be shared outside the family. There are things that should really be reserved, and that it doesn't do anything for anyone. I think there's the age that we live in the US is one of total revelation and kind of curated revelation in all of these different forms of social media. And it took, as I said, the first wave of Iranian American memoir was really around the time of the Iraq invasion. And there's been different kinds of speculation about why that was, but that's already, right, just about 30 years after, or 25 years after the revolution. So it took almost a full generation for that kind of disclosure to begin.
Yeah, and I think
I tend to think,
go ahead, Keith.
well, I tend to think it's, I mean, I agree, of course, with Dr. Motlach about this, because I see it, right, that Middle Eastern, I don't want to use sort of broad, in a very broad sense, there isn't this sense that you need to tell these things to outsiders, right? But on the other hand, what I was seeing with Maryam was less, I'm not sure her mother, that was her reticence. But what I thought what I was seeing between the two was kind of that generational shift that's been traced in other diasporas, which is, hey, now it's time to tell the story. Okay, we're safe, we're doing well. I got some things that kind of feel weird about my life. Can you help me understand, right? It's like, you know, a memoir like Mouse and that kind of difficult, they don't have a difficult relationship at all. It was actually very nice to see, but the relationship in Mouse between the author and his father was very difficult. And I think about the memoir of Peter Balakian and sort of his relationship with other adult figures in his life and how hard it was to get them to talk. So I think what we watched there was just an example from within the Iranian diaspora of that process taking place. And it's recurred so much, it's not phenomenal. It seems to be something very human to want to tell these stories, but only when people feel safe, I think. I mean, her mom was like a political leader in Germany. She was a well-respected actress. They didn't have the concerns of the past were not going to do any, well, they could do damage to them in the present, but they weren't as at risk as they might have been elsewhere. We're not talking outside the family is a survival strategy.
Yeah, and I was just going to add to the good points you both made, that I think, now we know very well the huge number of memoirs, representations of, for example, the memories of the survivors of the Jewish community, but it did take a while, I think quite often. Famously the movie Shoah, the famous documentary Shoah, considered one of the greatest documentaries about the Holocaust, is all about the resistance to explaining what happened. And in that, this film really did remind me of certain moments of Shoah, where you watch people being interviewed who really hesitate to articulate their memories, but then they come around to it, often via details. I mean, that's the strategy in Shoah, is that the interviewer will use details to get people to remember things there is a real resistance to. So I think it's important to remember that the Holocaust was farther in the past, and it did take time, I think, for people to come to terms with passing on this memory. And as Professor Wadenpaugh is saying, that there's this crucial intergenerational moment where people feel maybe more of a duty to pass on some of these memories. And sometimes it is to grandchildren, I think, too, as was mentioned. So there's a question about why it is so important that these memories be passed on, from Martha Rudma, about why it's important that for this information about political persecution to be passed on to future generations, and what service that can do for future communities.
Well, I mean, in the case of this particular history, I do think it's an important one, not just, I mean, clearly it served a role in this person's emotional development, right? And their ability to kind of come to terms with her parents' past. But when she was speaking to a scholar, the French-Iranian scholar of imprisonment, I thought the way that she characterized that, right, that this isn't just for you that you do this, right, that you try to recover this history, this is for all of us. And this is a kind of silence and an omission in the official history of Iran during this period. And we have a responsibility to try to illuminate it and make sure it becomes part of the record.
Great, so we're right at 6 o'clock. I think that's actually a very good note to end on. Thank you all for your questions. I don't know if you want to make any closing comments. I think both of you thought it was a good film and well worth revisiting. And it is interesting that it's at a kind of pivot moment in some ways, because this isn't a past that far away in some ways. And as we've been discussing, the regime is still in power there. So that also adds a different light on it, casts a different light on it, I think, so.
I'll just say in conclusion, I found it a very powerful, surprisingly powerful film. I definitely recommend watching it. I will be rewatching it and possibly using it when I teach. And I also just wanted to thank you, Jamie and Gina and Keith, for this opportunity to discuss the film. We're living in strange times, as a famous Iranian poem has it, but it's good to connect in these ways. Thank you.
And I just want to again thank Amy for having a cup of coffee with me and talking about a film. It was just a really nice. I miss those days so much. But also remind people we have 4 other great films that we're showing as part of this film festival. And we watched Gather last night, which is the most appropriate Thanksgiving film you can possibly imagine. And I would encourage everyone to take a look at that. And our next one is Maxima, right?
Correct.
Which is a great
Maxima
David and Goliath, which is a great David and Goliath story, and then 2 more stories from here, from California, that will round out the series this year.
Right, and the conversations will be at 5:10 p.m. Tomorrow with the directors of each film. Then Thursday with Belly of the Beast, about California prisons and forced sterilization of women in California prisons. And then on Friday, The Force, a conversation also at 5:10 p.m. with the director of The Force, which is about the Oakland Police Department and the struggles of urban police department in these tricky times. So, So thank you both so much for participating and for all your work in this direction. And we look forward to collaborating with you both in the future. Thank you, everybody, for coming and for the great questions. Good night.